Okay, and the session will be available for viewing via our YouTube channel, and we'll usually get that posted up on the SPE London website after about a week. Okay, so yeah, Alison's going to do the introduction. Our speaker today, Dr. Amanda Turner from Sustainable. She'll be presenting for 35 minutes or so, and there'll be ample time, I hope, for Q&A at the end of that. If you are wanting to submit questions, do so via the chat function on Zoom. If it doesn't appear on the bottom of your Zoom screen, just click on the 3 dots more button and you'll find it there. We're keeping sort of cameras and mics turned off for everyone who's not speaking. But yeah, hopefully you have a very good, interesting, enjoyable session. So Alison, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Barney. Welcome, everyone. It's been a while since I've been involved in one of these, but it's fantastic that we're still going with these webinars, which we've been doing for a number of years now. I think we've been talking about this particular one and having a session on this for a while, as companies have been setting targets and then starting to put action plans together and try and make progress on those. So the list of the topics that we'll cover are here, and hopefully a lot of you have got some questions and thoughts you'd like to share on these things, these topics. So I'm delighted that Amanda can join us. Dr. Amanda Turner has a long history in the oil and gas business in both technical and commercial roles. I'm sure she will talk you through more of that. I know since 2017 she's been working kind of across the energy transition space, so she's seen a lot and gained a lot of insights, not least working with Sustainable over the last year or so, working with oil and gas companies who are trying to put together their response to the net zero mission and how they're going to address their own emissions and wider sustainability. So Amanda had a PhD in sedimentology and paleomagnetism, so quite a technical background, but now she works across a much wider remit around sustainability. So I guess I will just pass over to Amanda to start the talk today, and we'll come back to you at the end with a Q&A session. So please put any questions you have in the chat and we'll address those at the end.
So if you want to share your screen, Amanda.
Is that, am I sharing? Can you see?
Not seeing that. Alison, are you seeing?
No, I'm still seeing your intro slide, but that's gone now, so maybe it will come back.
I'm going to try again, Amanda. If not, then I can.
It's like perfectly earlier, didn't it?
Yeah, it's always the way. We've had this before. If not, I can always share the PDF version.
Just give me a minute. That's the big screen now. Hang on.
Which, yeah, I can share the PDF version if that would help.
Let me give one more try.
I'll try, of course. Aha, that was nearly it.
Let's say I'm screen sharing, but clearly.
Yeah, for some reason it's not coming through.
Okay, I think you're going to have to put the
No
PDF version
worries.
up.
Are you seeing? I'm not sure that's shared properly, has it?
I can see it.
You can see it, good.
Yes.
Okay, so if you just tell me when to, yeah, if there's thumbs up there, you tell me when to move the screen on, Amanda.
Yeah, if you could move it to the next slide and the next slide. I just wanted to say thank you to Barney and to Alison for that introduction, and apologies for the technical issues. It's always the way, isn't it? So, so let's get started. A little bit about myself. I've been around a long time, and some of you I know on the meeting will have known me for a while. I started, well, the picture on the top right there shows me getting my PhD, and as we said, I studied under someone called Peter Turner at Aston, and then moved to Birmingham when they merged, and I gained my PhD in paleomagnetism and diagenesis of permatriassic red beds, and that was very useful in moving on into the oil and gas industry, where I worked in the Southern Gas Basin as an exploration geologist for Mobil before it became ExxonMobil. That's how long ago it was. And I worked, that's me on the rig floor on, I think it's called the Ocean Ben Armin rig, if any of you remember back to those days, catching some core there. And it was great at the time because Mobil allowed the explorationists, and I worked in a team with, usually they paired you up with a geophysicist who decided where to drill the wells, and then got to go offshore and see if you're successful. And that one is actually on the, more or less, I think we focused on the Camelot field and its surrounding satellite sort of discoveries, which is ironic really, because it's sort of come full circle, because I know that field has just been given a license for carbon capture and storage. So yeah, it's interesting. So I just wanted to show that I've actually been out there and worked at the sharp end of things. I moved through technical roles, and then been up and down, as many of you will have experienced yourselves in the oil and gas industry, through booms and busts, and have been made redundant on more than one occasion. Got an MBA, switched to defence. You see Kinetic there for 10 years or so, where I worked in more commercial roles, strategy, innovation, and mergers and acquisitions, and then came back to the oil and gas sector via Esri UK, where I was commercial director for their business based in Aylesbury. And then gradually a few other jobs in different size companies, to the point where I, through roundabout lockdown time, and through constant questioning my career by my grown-up kids about being in the evil fossil fuel industry, I actually took a course at Cambridge University on business sustainability management. And I found that really interesting, and became a sustainability consultant. And I've worked with sustainable for the last couple of years. And mainly, if you can move on to the next slide, our team works with oil and gas companies to help them look at their sustainability credentials, their emissions, etc. And all of us have got backgrounds that are oil and gas and energy based, and we've worked as geologists and engineers in commercial, environmental, and operations for both operators and service companies. So we have, if you can move on. I sort of feel that I've got some knowledge from both sides, really, the hard end of getting out there on rigs, and also now from looking at emissions. And we advise companies, and you can see the list of sort of advisory activities that we do, and also due diligence as well. So we work with some of the stakeholder side of people who are looking to invest in companies and help them make their decisions. And this is becoming more and more of a essential activity that particularly investors will be doing before they invest in companies. So I think if we move to the next slide, we're looking at trends and challenges. Class is unfortunate, I forgot about this. So I've got various slides. Yeah. So basically what we're saying here is that litigation is on the rise, and there have been several lawsuits, and even in recent weeks there's been Sweden's climate plan has been slammed by watchdogs, and New York is suing the world's biggest meat company. So there's a lot of litigation going on because a lot of claims being made by companies which cannot really be substantiated. And the picture on the top here shows that over time you can see that there's been quite a growth in litigation cases. 2023 is only shown figures until May, so that's why it looks so low. But essentially you can see that it is becoming a big issue, that you've got to be able to substantiate any of your sustainability claims with real data and evidence to back it up. Next slide. And you'll probably, and some of you will know anyway, that there are a number of different standards out there and frameworks. There are multiple acronyms. These are hard to remember. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that they apply to various regions. Some of them are global, some of them are like EU based, some of them are UK based, and it is my little person scratching their head in the corner. I find this quite baffling. We have people in sustainable who are much better at understanding and following the different standards, and they're coming thick and fast, and they're forever changing, and there's more and more that are becoming mandatory. Many of them are voluntary at the moment, but they are coming, and they're becoming increasingly mandatory. So people need to be aware of these and to be preparing to adhere to them. If you go to the next slide, one of the drivers for the sustainability reporting is increasing regulation, as we've said, and the risk of fines and punishment for non-compliance. There's also societal pressure from stakeholders, and growing awareness of impact of climate change on the communities and the planet from, you know, the company's impact. And perhaps one of the most significant issues is the pressure from banks, lenders, and investors wanting to ensure that there's minimal financial risk to their investments. And that's what's really driving this requirement for companies to become more sustainable and report on their activities to demonstrate to their stakeholders that they are actually doing this. So this slide just shows, you know, some of the key ones that are, and you can see how recent they all are, that it is very much a current issue, that, that in the Europe, the corporate sustainability reporting disclosure is one of the key areas, and it applies to large listed companies and will be gradually moving down the scale to SMEs as well. We've also got the Transition Plan Task Force, the TPT, which is UK based currently voluntarily, but is increasing. And you'll note that Scope 3, and I'll get onto that in a minute, is becoming increasingly required as well, reporting on Scope 3 emissions. And then there's the ISSB climate-related disclosures, which is global, and that is very much becoming something that everyone is being required to adhere to. It reminds me a little bit, I don't know if you're old enough to remember when data standards came in about the 1990s. There were multiple different bodies, and gradually over time they all started to align together to create a more global standardized sort of data reporting form that everyone understood, and it's becoming the same in the sustainability ESG space. And the US is slightly different. They have another one, but all of them, if you can see, the Scope 3 requirements are increasing. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see that this shows that I'm sure you're familiar with the scopes, but I'll just briefly outline them. Essentially, Scope 1 is a company's or an organisation's direct emissions. Scope 2 is the indirect emissions, which is things like particularly purchased energy that they have for heating, cooling, you know, electricity, or utilities bills, essentially. And then there's Scope 3, and there's two parts to Scope 3 emissions. One of them is it's in the supply chain, essentially, is your upstream activities, and then downstream activities. I think there are 15 different scopes, aspects to Scope 3. And quite often companies only report on one or two because it is more difficult to identify these emissions and to measure them, particularly when they're not under your direct responsibility. And people tend to prioritise the use of sold products, which is the one I've sort of highlighted here. But you know, there are several others which are important. And as we've said, that Scope 3 is becoming something that is a requirement, more and more a requirement. Companies are going to be, you know, it's going to be important that they do have an awareness of where their Scope 3 emissions are and are able to collate those and report on them. So, yeah, these are, you need to, if you go to the next slide, you need to, you know, report on things that are material to a company. And that means, you know, the things that are create big emissions, the things that are, there's a large amount of spend and that are critical to the success of that company. And this is a spreadsheet that shows a number of companies. I've anonymized the companies. We did this as a peer review for one of our clients, and they were looking at Scope 3 reporting. And you can see that a number of companies, some of the good ones, report across the spectrum, and you can see the scope categories on the right-hand side. The highest reported is number 11, which is as we said, the use of sold product. But there are several others that are reported upon as well. So purchase goods, upstream, transport and distribution, and business travel. And there are some companies that basically, well, they do a vague amount of scope 3 reporting, and some others that don't report on any of this. So it's just an interesting slide to show that the mix, the range of reporting, scope 3 reporting particularly, that goes on. These I should have added, these are oil and gas companies, different sizes, but were relevant to our particular client. If you go to the next slide, please. So the other thing that's becoming the norm is something called doing a materiality assessment, in particular a double materiality assessment. And double materiality refers to a sort of a two-way perspective, outside in, which is how ESG issues affects a company's performance and development, and the other way around, the inside out, is how a company's impacts in its people and the environment around it. And so we help companies review their material issues and create a materiality assessment for them. And this is important for several of the big standards are expecting this sort of work to be done on them. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, yeah. So another of the standard that's increasingly coming in is the TNFD, and this is Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. So previously, there's been focus on climate-related disclosures and the impact on the climate, but more and more investors and shareholders are, and the financial communities in general, are expecting people to report on their impact on biodiversity and nature. And the centre of the screen here, you can see that Sustainable has recently completed a case study for a client on exactly that. And you can look that up on LinkedIn or on our website. So it is something that is coming. So if you haven't already done it, people need to be looking at their impact on nature and biodiversity as much as their sort of emissions directly to affecting climate. Next one, please. So, okay, coming closer to home then. So in the last, I think it was 3 weeks ago now, 27th of March, the Nesta has produced a plan. It's been consulted the industry, and some of you may have been part of that consultation. And it's for particularly the UKCS and companies that are working on their oil and gas companies, and going forward, what is it they're expecting to do? So I've just summarised here some of the key points, and this is my own assessment of what I'm picking out of the key points from this plan. But some of them are interesting. So it's continuing, I mean, you can read them here, but rapid and sustained reductions in oil and gas production emissions. It continues to be essential. You've got the, we must take appropriate steps to assist the Secretary of State in meeting zero targets by reducing greenhouse gas emissions from sources. And it names this also flaring and venting, power generation, and supporting carbon capture and storage projects. So it actually highlights carbon capture and storage as being something it's looking at. And also consider the societal costs of emissions. So thinking about the wider impacts that our companies make. And interestingly, also specifies that emissions offsetting will not be considered towards meeting the obligations of the plan. Next slide, please. And it expects investments. So the companies are expected to fork out some money to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across the extraction operations. We need to produce an ERAP, which is an environmental emissions reduction action plan for each asset, and also a supply chain action plan as well. So quite a lot of work to be done here, and time and effort put in. Also, the whole of this electrification, they're looking for us to electrify our platforms, our fields by 2030. All new developments have to be, and also document, demonstrate the split of projected flaring and venting figures to support the delivery of net zero by 2030, I think it is, isn't it? And then deliver continuous reductions in fugitive emissions. So a pretty onerous set of requirements, most of these are, that they put out there. And next slide. The other thing I know we just wanted to make here is about this maximising economic recovery, which is something that they stress as well. So as well as adhering to all these emissions reduction requirements, we still have to maximise economic recovery. And here I've highlighted some of the sections from that plan that have actually stressed that as well. So secure the maximum value of economic recoverable petroleum is recovered from the strata beneath the UK waters, meet the optimum configuration for maximising the value of economically recoverable petroleum. And in addition to electrification, Nesta will also consider other forms of low carbon power consistent with maximising economic recovery. So my little cartoon there, we're caught between a rock and a hard place, because we have to adhere and pay out all these costs, which are going to reduce any profits being made and taxes to the government, but we've been still challenged with maximising economic recovery. So it's a bit of a conundrum, that. Interesting to hear your thoughts. Yes, so the next section tackles this missed net zero targets, and there have been several criticisms. There's been a criticism that people, BP here and Shell, are abandoning previous sustainability targets, emissions targets, and that's considered, it's not appreciated by society and critics. However, I just also put this note up that it is possible to go too much the other way potentially, and that it's a couple of years ago now, but Danone, who's the big food producer and retailer famous for its yogurts, ousted the chief executive and chairman for being too sustainable. He was focusing and spending so much money on ESG and sustainability that there was a shareholder revolt, certainly, and a sort of an activist shareholder community who actually managed to get him sacked because they weren't happy that he wasn't delivering enough of shareholder returns. So it's a fine balance. None of these things seem to me to be purely black and white. There is an amount of balance and required. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, I'm just going to talk a little bit about emissions reduction technologies. So essentially, there's four sort of key areas that companies can cut their emissions, and this particularly in oil and gas anyway: flaring, venting, leakage, fugitive emissions, and general operations. And there are ways to tackle this. There's the increase. If you can't measure something, you can't reduce it. So increased measurement and monitoring. Implement new technologies, and there are several technologies out there that could be used to help reduce emissions, and often just operational behavioural changes that can be made. So next slide, please. So looking at venting, the obvious thing is that, and I appreciate that some amount of venting is a requirement for health and safety reasons, because if you get a build-up of gases, you pose a risk of explosion. So you have to, this is not relating to the sort of health and safety aspects of it, because that's a given. But you can flare gas as rather than vent it, because as I'm sure you all know, methane is a much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, which is what you put into the atmosphere when you burn it. So one thing is to flare rather than vent. Another is, and here's a couple of other technologies that we've looked at. I did a project for Sustainable, looking at a number of different technologies that one of our company's clients requested. So you could capture the gas and reuse it, and there are several technologies that you can use that and actually make some money out of it. Vapor recovery units, blowdown capture. I won't go into all of these, but I can offline, if anyone wants to talk about them in more detail, I can go through those. Blowdown capture, install a plunger lift, and there's a picture of that on the right, I think. Next slide. Flaring the gas more efficiently. One of the things I should add here is that during the course of this study that I did, I've identified lots of technologies, and many of these technologies were already, in place. Some of them are more recent developments, but many of them are already in place and are being used not specifically for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but principally to make oil and gas companies more efficient, more operationally efficient, and reduce costs, so increasing profits. So now that they've realised that there is this whole new market and people are looking at these technologies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, they're adjusting their marketing to target those markets. So I found that quite interesting. And there are some adjustments needed specifically to reduce the emissions, but essentially they're being repurposed, a lot of these technologies, for the greenhouse gas emissions markets. So here's some technologies for, if you go back, sorry, then the last, so for picture on the right shows the Flare IQ, which is Baker Hughes technology, which actually allows you to closely monitor your flare gas, and because not all of it is burned when it's flared, and to make it more efficient, and that way reducing your amount of emissions. And then there's several others here that you can see that are also go some way to reducing the flare gas. Next one. And then operational, fugitive emissions, yeah. So nobody wants to have escaped gas. And you've got vapor recovery units, improved leak detection, repair, preventative maintenance, and dry gas seals, as opposed to wet gas seals, which they're much more efficient. Next slide, please. And then operational emission reduction technologies. So you can replace diesel with gas-powered vehicles, electrification of equipment using renewable energy, carbon capture and storage, and capture exhaust gases and use to heat and drive steam turbines. And there are examples of a number of companies that are putting these technologies into practice pretty effectively. And, reducing, as I said, reducing their costs as well as their emissions. So, it's a sort of a virtuous sort of thing to do. Pays for themselves to be implemented. Next slide. And this slide is taken from a recent presentation by Nesta from the emissions reduction action plans that had been submitted to them in recent months or years. And you can see, you can't read all the stuff on the left, but you can see that essentially there are various abatement options being implemented by companies in UKCS, and the percentages are shown there. So the highest is optimizing existing operations and modifying flare event systems. So you can see they're putting into practice some of those technologies that I showed you earlier. Next slide, please. Offsetting, just a quick word on offsetting. As you previously mentioned, the Nesta don't appear to be, anyway, from their new plan, supporter of companies using offsetting to reach net zero. This is a graph on the left taken from ExxonMobil's 2024 sustainability report, and that shows that they are using, and a number of companies that we've dealt with are using offsets as a method of achieving some of their net zero ambitions, or certainly their carbon reduction targets. And that's fair enough. And to a certain extent, it would be impossible to achieve net zero without some degree of potential offsetting. But there is a danger, as you can see from the comments on the right, that this doesn't go down well in some communities, and people see particularly sort of buying the way to net zero without actually addressing every single option that you have to reduce your carbon footprint, is seen as potentially even being greenwashing, in which case you might suffer reputational damage by choosing that route. You really have to have considered all other options, I think, before you do go down the offset route. Next slide, please. And this is taken from MSCI Carbon Markets report, which shows a number of different options or projects that can be used as a way of reducing or offsetting your carbon footprint, and it includes things like nature restoration, which is planting trees essentially, and also in in emerging countries as well, the red, where they are paid to not deforest their areas. So it is widely used, and I don't know if you've seen in recent days, this was only in the last week, that the Science-Based Technology Institute has been highly critical. Well, the staff have been highly critical for it now allowing carbon offsetting as part of its well, just allowing it when it really when it's very much for reducing the carbon emissions and achieving net zero. And there's the call by the staff for the CEO to resign over sort of going back on and its promise to do that. Next slide. So what can companies do to get it right? I think this is an example of a materiality assessment that Sustainable has actually done. It's part of the Trinity's annual report, I think, shown here. And you can see that what this does is on the x-axis, you've got the impact of issues on Trinity's business, and on the vertical axis you've got the impact on the stakeholders. So you get the stakeholder view and you get the business view, and you look at what's going to impact, what's material to their business. And as you can see here, climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, and asset integrity and incident management are, as you might predict, at the highest end of the scale. And what you also notice here is they've been also tied to the United Nations SDGs, the Sustainability Development Goals. And this is very much a norm for companies when they put their sustainability strategies out there and reports to tie it to one of those goals or more than one of those goals, which are recognised around the world as being a sort of gold standard. You need to be able to make sure that that they are absolutely resilient, that they are measurable. You can substantiate and defend any of the items that you've taken there. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yes. So we need to look at all a company when it's trying to achieve its net zero and examine its own emissions. Particularly, we need to look at all ESG related data up and down the supply chain and everything it's all of its activities, and look at its scope 1, 2 and 3. The other thing you need to do and understand that the sources and be able to defend them and report on them. Need also to take time, although some of these standards aren't coming into becoming mandatory for the next couple of years. There's an awful lot of information to gather and to present, and need to do that work now and start it now, because it will be too late if you just think you're going to be able to gather it and present it in a few months. So, and as we said, the task force TNFD for nature related financial disclosures is very much coming as well. So you need to look at your biodiversity impacts as well as climate. Next slide. So ensure that everything that you've done is explored. There are companies out there that make big quotes on their websites and pages, and some companies from our industry do that and haven't really got that evidence and data to back it up. So that will easily be taken apart by anyone who reviews, especially investors and lenders who want to invest. So it's in your own interest to do it. They have to be realistic. Your targets and goals need to be realistic and timely. So make sure that you're not trying to claim ridiculous timescales for achieving net zero without a real plan to get it there. And you really do need to back it up with data and be accountable. And then finally, I think there's next slide. Very important is the whole communication side of this. You need to have buy-in both internally from your staff and your stakeholders, externally from anyone that you deal with, and society as well, and just be able to present that well. You also need to be able to, within your organisation, perhaps have role identification within that strategy. And I've worked with companies that have nominated sort of sustainability champions that identify new sustainability or opportunities or areas where they could reduce their emissions, and encourage and enthuse about it within the staff environment and identify problems as well. So I think make sure everyone knows their role in this, and it's not just a single person from the top telling you what to do. And also, make sure that the ESG targets are turned into KPIs. So as part of your overall performance measurements within the organisation and business strategy, you are measuring this as you go along, and have, you've set a base year and then report regularly, if not quarterly, of how you're achieving against those goals. And so that people can see that you're demonstrating that you are achieving what you set out to achieve. It's behavioural change, that you want. And I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Amanda. That was covered a lot of topics there. And I can see from the questions that there's quite a lot around the OGA plan. So we will come back to that in a minute and have a little debate on that. I had a question on more that last slide you put in terms of roles within pushing this forward in companies. And I'm interested, I mean, you talked about champions lower down, but I'm interested because obviously sustainable deals with different sizes of companies, quite a lot of small companies. I mean, what are you seeing as people try and put these strategies in place as to how they change maybe the management team at the top, the governance, I mean, is everyone putting a specific sustainability officer on the exec team, or does it vary? Is there kind of a pattern?
No, it varies hugely, and I agree. I think that there should be a sustainability expert on the board of every company. And when I say an expert, I think at least the minimum they should have taken a course or two, or if they're not from a sustainability or environmental or ESG type background. But I think someone that has some knowledge would be good. And we have actually done board training courses, so that rather than one, the whole board has as a measure. Obviously, you can't become an expert in a few hours of a training course, but at least raising awareness. But because it's so important in every aspect of the company's operations and in shareholders and investments and lenders, you need someone at the highest level to be aware that this is becoming key for the organization, and they ignore it at their peril, really.
So yeah, I guess people are still trying to figure out the best way to govern themselves to make this work.
There are also companies that have they have multiple, so operations directors are also taking on the responsibility of all of the sustainability implementations, which is, that's a tough challenge for a single person. But obviously it's also expense to hire a completely separate person to specialize in that.
Yeah, no, I guess everyone's feeling their way. If we come back to the OGA plan, because obviously that's been published very recently after consultation, and I think a couple of the headlines you put up there caught people's attention. I think one of the questions is, do I understand that companies can't use offsetting to meet their targets? I think you confirmed that later on, that is specifically stated. Is that correct?
Yeah, I lifted that pretty much word for word from the plan.
Yeah. So I suppose there's a lot of people kind of saying, someone makes a comment, the whole justification of DRAX is based on offsetting. Why is there not a consistent UK government approach? I guess there's some surprise around that. Was that a surprise when you saw that? Or has that been communicated before?
Well, I've only had 3 weeks to digest the fact that they've said that. Obviously, companies that have overseas operations as well, not every company is completely focused on the UK activities, will be able to continue to use offsetting, I presume. It's only these, I think, new going forward, the offsetting is not considered to be.
I mean, I'm wondering, I've heard the term insetting as well, rather than offsetting, where people are perhaps diversifying what they're doing internally. So they have more responsibility for those offsetting projects, not just paying someone else. But I guess for us in oil and gas, that's carbon capture is one possible example of that, that's seen a lot. And maybe that's the focus. But I mean, the other comment was around, electrification or low carbon after 2030. Isn't that simply going to displace potential homegrown production with overseas imports? And I know at Sustainable, we've looked at charts and numbers and things on that, comparing it, and it's a big argument for the North Sea. I don't know if you have any comments on that one.
No, I don't. I know that it's a really contentious area, and there's the government, Nesta has left some wriggle space, I think, there, doesn't it? It will consider other options. So, you know, if someone can put a well-argued position of not electrifying and putting something else there, it seems that they may well get a hearing, but until it's tested, we don't really know.
Yeah, I guess people want people to put together the the plan and the budget and how much it's going to be. And I think some people are starting to do that now. And I agree it's going to look quite tough in some areas. So there may be room for, renegotiation.
I think sort of just jumping in there, I think part of the sort of messaging which is coming through in the chat is sort of, is the UK oil and gas industry putting itself at a disadvantage because of standards applied or certain requirements, or how do you see that? Is it a level playing field?
I'd say the answer to that is probably a political question, given that there's an election coming up and they're trying to be all things to all people. So I don't want to be seen to be, that's all I can say. Is I think there's political reasons for some of the decisions that they've made and being hard on the oil and gas industry. So yeah. That's what I think.
Yeah, it's a tricky one.
Yeah. Did you have another that you wanted to highlight in the questions? They're coming quite thick and fast now. I think quite a lot of them are around this lack of level playing field globally, with how people approach this.
Well, it's, the sad thing is that you can see that investment is moving away from the UK. Small companies and large companies are finding it increasingly difficult to get the investment required to drill wells, to explore, because there's a more favourable environment in other places. And ultimately, companies aren't there to be charitable. They're there to make profits, to give back to their investors. And if they see it's a lot easier in another jurisdiction, then they will move. And
I mean, there's a lot of focus with Nesta on, because of the net zero target, I guess, just on greenhouse gas emission reduction. And that's, yes, you need that focus for it to happen. But someone's put here about shouting more about social benefits, etc. I guess the wider sustainability that you look at with people on ESG, because it is more than just reducing greenhouse gas emissions, looking at that wider remit would highlight some of those other things, but it's difficult when Nesta start putting regulation in for specifically reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's what drives action, I guess. Is that what you would say, regulation? There's been a lot of voluntary stuff up to this point, but in terms of spending money, it's been
I'd say, on those 3 points that I think I said the regulation definitely does, because people don't want to pay penalties or fines. It's not so much the regulation, it's if you don't adhere to the regulation and you get fined, or you get reputational damage, which effectively, it all comes down really to money, I think, a lot of the time. It's a tricky one. Although, I'll go back to sustainability has 3 pillars, and people, planet, and profit. So a business isn't sustainable if it's going bust because it can't, earn enough money. So it is one of the founding pillars. So it's tricky. I try and be really pragmatic about sustainability, and it's a balancing act.
I think just on another question, there's an interesting one around the sort of, I guess it's around scope 3 emissions, that a lot of emissions associated with oil and gas is end use rather than the production itself. If oil and gas companies are sort of logging their scope 3 emissions better, would that help illustrate to the wider public that this isn't just about keeping stopping oil and gas companies doing their activities. It's about society as a whole reducing their reliance on oil and gas.
It's a personal thing, but I totally believe that, because I think if people realise that, you know, it's the demand side that's creating these scope 3 emissions. You know, it's the end users that are, you know, it's most of the UK anyway. I can comment on the UK, still has gas boilers in their houses, and you know, people aren't that prepared to fork out loads of money to change that, and they want their heating on in the cold weather. So you know, and that's what's puts the scope 3 up, which always makes oil and gas companies look as if they're the bad guys, because they have such high overall emissions if you count all the emissions. But other industries are equally high. You know, things, well, have also got high scope 3 emissions. So you know, even the renewables industry, if you look at, you know, the extraction, because they rely on, you know, materials when extraction of, you know, things like lithium, nickel, to make them, even though their absolute sort of operational emissions are low, the overall emissions are quite a lot more than perhaps they would want people to realise. And I'm always, when I give talks, which I do, on the end-to-end emissions of industries, that people are really surprised at just how much the emissions in, say, renewable energies contribute as well. I think it would be good to make people aware of that, yes.
There's a lot of very tough questions on here, Amanda.
I'm not seeing them, so it's probably good that I can't see them.
Probably. So, I mean, yeah, we know this is a very tricky subject when you're trying to look at uneven action across the globe, uneven focus between industries, a lack of understanding of the numbers. I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head there. If everyone had all the numbers at their fingertips and they could easily communicate various that to everyone around the world, you know, the society, in terms of our impact and benefit, it might be easy, but there's so much that's hard to communicate. There's a lot of and there's a lot of numbers that aren't out there. A lot of people who I mean, I'm interested. I guess the easy thing in oil and gas, I say easy, but easier, is probably the focus on methane. Are you seeing that with clients, a lot more focus on methane reduction than CO2 reduction, given something that actually might make more economic sense?
Each company has a different set of sort of activities, operations, assets in different locations, and so there's no one size fits all. It depends. But obviously, because methane has 28 times more potency as a greenhouse gas over 100 years than carbon dioxide, it's an obvious one to focus on. And so I think you could reduce your, you know, when you and as it's presented as carbon dioxide equivalent, that will bring the numbers down considerably if you get rid of your methane, either through fugitive emissions or through venting, for example. I think it's a positive one to focus on if you can. Some companies don't have a lot of methane emissions, and other companies routinely flare huge amounts, less so in the UK, but there are stories I've heard of massive amounts of flaring still that could be curtailed.
Hopefully it would be a positive if you looked at how we are reducing methane emissions. I would hope that would be a positive story across most of the North Sea, I hope. Barney, have you got any closing remarks? I know we've hit half past.
Yeah, we've hit half past. I think the subject is sort of progress of oil and gas companies towards net zero, and just a very general question, which hopefully can have one answer, is sort of what are the big blockers in your view, Amanda? Is it regulation? Is it technology? Is it the economics of it all, or is it around the sensibility? You know, people, the blockers. What are the main blockers?
So what, hitting net zero?
Oil and gas companies getting to their net zero targets, which is what what we're trying to get at.
I don't think there's one simple answer to that question. I think embracing it or recognise it. I think there's pushback. I think there's financial. You know, it's the whole. You know, are we here to make profits for our shareholders and stakeholders, or are we here to balance the, you know, be kind to the planet and to our people, which is more sort of honourable. But you saw from the Danone experience that sometimes you can get kicked out for not delivering financial results. I'm not here to judge that. I just think there are many ways, and it's up to you to decide. You know, where you want to invest if you're an investor or your pension fund, and B, who you want to work for, and you know, if that's something that bothers you, and then it's as an individual you can have your own thoughts on that.
Make your choices. Thanks, Amanda. Yeah, that's all from me, Alison.
Yeah, thanks, Amanda. I mean, we could have a whole discussion on carbon pricing, but I think that's a subject for another day, at how that drives it or doesn't drive things. But thank you very much, Amanda. It's really not an easy subject, and it's basically open-ended. But I think you hopefully highlighted some of where the regulation is going and some of the reporting standards and what's happening to some of the companies out there who are trying to do things or not do things, and how they're being affected. So hopefully that's been informative to everyone, and they can go away and continue to think about it. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Amanda, and thanks to the audience as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for all the questions. Bye.